Now I'm directing my next question mainly to Neil and Sally, because I'm very keen to hear your insights on non-gender areas of diversity and whether they're being addressed in the firm you're currently with or in other aspects. Neil, I have you slated down for cultural and in particular Asian, from the Asian perspective, given your background with Mallesons and their recent liaison with the Asian legal firms. So I might start with you, and then Sally, sexual orientation might be a topic you might like to talk to the group about.
Okay, well, cultural diversity has been a focus for the firm King Wood Mallesons for some time, but I think they've always struggled to define what actually the outcome looks like. But I think in many ways there's a parallel track to the gender agenda. Partnership and leadership of firms and most businesses in Australia are not only male-dominated, they're white, heterosexual, male-dominated at a certain age. There's a cultural dimension to that too. The bamboo ceiling, as it's called, the lack of Asian representation in particular, as leadership levels in business in Australia is just as challenging an issue. And the gap that leaves is a greater diversity of thinking. There's a clear business case for cultural diversity at leadership levels. It generates better outcomes. Interesting experiences I had with King Wood Mallesons is obviously the merger between Mallesons and Jakes and King Wood, the major Chinese law firm. That created a whole focus around cross-cultural awareness and understanding and recognition that if we are going to be successful in our strategy of building growth in Asia, the ability for Australians and Chinese or Asian colleagues to work together to interact with clients and other stakeholders successfully, bridging the cultural differences, and you really can't get two cultures more diametrically opposed on most measures than Australian and Chinese cultures. The great thing about that was that there was a very clear line of sight from cultural intelligence, shall we call it, to successful business outcomes. And that's given us a whole new focus around what the cultural agenda looks like. For me, the next step would be to build on that and look at how we can build more culturally diverse partnerships, both in China and Australia, which are relatively homogeneous in cultural terms at the moment.
Excellent, thank you. And Sally?
I think I mentioned before that when we came together as part of the international organisation and we had action plans for all aspects of diversity at Norton Rose, that I realised, looking at what we were doing at the other member firms, that they had done a lot more in the LGBT space. And so we've been able
explain to the audience the acronym. Some of them may not be familiar with it.
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. I'm not sure in which particular order. I always get it all around the wrong way. But I think for me this is an issue that's more about inclusiveness, and when we were starting to set our policies in things, some really interesting discussions around oh well, you can't go out and survey that and ask that question because some people might not be comfortable about revealing their sexuality or otherwise. And to me that really struck me as, what does that say about what the inclusiveness of our culture is, that somebody might feel frightened about saying that. And so I think our action plans involve, they're multifaceted, they're networking with clients, they're networking within our own organisation, they're building awareness, they're trying to build a culture where that is something where people should feel comfortable to be included, but it's obviously optional, and it's been really interesting to see how that's embraced. And another thing I felt was really critical was that they also have a sponsor from the boardroom, and it had a client dimension to it. We're working quite closely with some of the big accounting firms who have done quite a lot in this space too.
Any final tips for our audience of lawyers out there in relation to any item you feel you really have to hone in on the last message that you have? And I'll start with Karen.
Diversity is in the eye of the beholder in a lot of cases. We do a lot of work with sport organisations, with business, with local government. Local government at the moment is doing a national survey about their level of diversity because they say they're diverse, but their recruitment stopped with the post-World War II migration, and so their level of diversity relates to Greeks and Italians who are now about 50 years old. And because they've been recruiting the same people who look like them because they're diverse, their entire workforce is going out backwards in about 10 years. So it's a really interesting conversation around having to think about, when you're talking about diversity, who are you talking to, and what are your measures, much as my own experience internally with my organisation was, yes, we're very diverse, but there's always, there's always another perspective on that, and so I just think the value of that conversation around what diversity is and what it looks like is really important.
I would say have the conversation. Just talk about the issues, talk about diversity, talk about inclusion, use the words, seek out perspectives from people who are different from yourself, and just keep having the conversations and keep learning.
I have found that sometimes you have to go beyond the generic firm-wide or organisation-wide business case and articulate what the individual business case is for a particular stakeholder. It's answering the what's in it for me question. And to do that, have that conversation, obviously you need to know quite a lot about the particular drivers and issues and challenges for that individual or for that team or for that part of the business. The other thing is around, in terms of converting words into action, I found that piloting is an incredibly valuable approach, and flexibility would be a good example of moving from policy into practice. And way of doing that is to create a small pilot in a fertile bit of the organisation where someone supportive is willing to try something new. But by calling it a pilot and managing it as a pilot, you reduce the risk. If it doesn't work, that's okay. We can go back to where we were, or we'll try something different. But either way, we'll get the learning from that, and we can then export the idea around the organisation.
We haven't touched on flexibility in any detail, and it's the subject of our whole day, really. But I firmly believe the next frontier is men mainstreaming flexibility. I firmly believe the way the profession works is unsustainable. I've learned how to make it work doing it flexibly and still having just as large a growing practice. So I've got suggestions for it, but I also am acutely aware that I think we've got lots and lots of men working flexibly, they just don't call it that. And I just think it's the way of the future, and we've got tools, and the more we can get senior leaders and senior male leaders and people like David Fogarty do it, saying what they're doing is a flexible arrangement, the more accepted and mainstreamed it will become. We need it for aged care. The men need to do it, they want to do it, but it's not safe yet for them to say that without being frowned upon. So there's a big job there. The other thing I just wanted to mention is the use of the gender pay equity audit. It's a fantastic tool. We think it's just about making sure that we've not got discrimination at the same level for the same job. But what doing a pay equity audit for your organisation unveils, generally and hopefully, is not that you're discriminating between men and women or race and otherwise for the same job, but where the gaps are in your organisation. So if you don't have many women, for example, in leadership positions, you're going to have a huge gender pay gap that's going to reveal where your pipeline is ailing. So that's been a fantastic tool that we've used, and any scale of organisation can do it.
Thank you so much, panellists. It's just been very an interesting dialogue. And now I'll hand over to Fiona Knowles.
Now, I thought just while people are thinking about some of the questions that they may ask, I might just run something by the panel that I've been thinking about is interviews and how, what strategies there might be to reduce bias in interviews. Has anyone got any tips on interviews? Yes, thank you.
I'm holding in my hand a card that all the partners and anyone that goes into an interview has at Norton Rose, and it says, in order to make the best decision when meeting, discussing with someone with something different to me, I'll treat them fairly and objectively. I will not stereotype or make assumptions about them. I'll treat them as an individual, and we just try and remind ourselves of that when you go into an interview, because it is amazing how many assumptions you make in an interview.
So, has anyone got any questions?
The question is then, how do you deal with the bias at the employment agency?
I reckon that the employment agencies are the sort of big untapped barrier for us in terms of unconscious bias. And if you look at the people who are doing the interviewing and their demographic and their age range, and all of their biases are coming into play. So I think having the clients sort of put the pressure on the employment agencies to say, you need to give us a more diverse slate of candidates is probably the way to...
Neil being in the HR side of the business that deals with them much more than I do.
Thank you. It's a good question, because I was going to make the point that actually the problem starts long before the interview takes place in terms of who actually gets to sit in that seat. I would also say that at least 2 interviewers, no one person should ever make the decision, and diverse perspectives is one of the really simplest but effective safeguards against unbiased. What we are seeing more and more is doing exactly what the organisations do, what Duncan was alluding to, which is to drive their commercial leverage to set service level agreements with external suppliers, including recruiters, whereby they have to demonstrate understanding of the client's, the organisation's diversity strategy. They have to have one of their own. They have to demonstrate their capability to source diverse candidates and create diverse candidate pools, and they will report on those at every stage of the recruitment process, from initial shortlist to interviewees and to hiring outcomes. Obviously the visibility of those metrics will allow the organisation to challenge where they think it's going wrong. So there is progress occurring to try and deal exactly with that, and I think organisations need to use their commercial leverage more in that case.
I'm just wondering if the panel could comment on the trend or the sort of experience that's been happening over the last 5 to 10 years of when people are interviewing, they talk about wanting to find a candidate who fits the culture of the firm. And I'm just wondering if the panel could comment on to what extent is this talk about my values or my firm's culture really just a mask for unconscious biases?
All firms have common values and a culture that you need to be mindful of, but that needs a lot more work to test what that cultural fit means. And the affinity bias is the one where you do worry that that's being played out.
Thank you, panel, for very lively and interesting discussion. Could people join me in thanking the panel?